Welcome to this presentation, Supporting Long-Term Athlete Development. The presentation was inspired by a paper by Jamie Taylor and Dave Collins, two practical academics who I have a great deal of respect for their work. Their paper looked at barriers to truly optimal practice to support young people to achieve their sporting potential. Now, my original intention was simply to do a short lecture for my MSc Performance Coaching students at the University of Stirling as part of a module on planning for performance to explore this paper. However, the stories told in that paper have much broader practical application relating to the challenges that sports administrators, coaches, athletes and their parents face in performance-orientated environments to support the performance of young people. Basically, what should be a positive experience often becomes one of frustration, inefficiency and perceived failures, which can result in conflict and sadness, and we don't want that. However, by better understanding what long-term athlete development is and how to support it, my optimistic side believes that we can all work together in the spirit of collaboration to make a positive difference for young people. So that's what this presentation is about. But who am I and why should you be listening to me? Well, my name is Dr. Andy Kirkland and I'm a generalist academic and a lecturer in sports coaching. My expertise comes from being a triathlon coach, through working at British Cycling, I'll often say in their glory years, as a coach developer, and I've also worked as a sports scientist at the Scottish Institute of Sport. I've got chartered scientist status too. I've coached a world champion, worked with athletes at every level of sport, and worked within a national governing body too. I wish that all my experiences had been a bowl of cherries, but I've seen many things along the way, faced challenges that weren't always pleasant, and I've had many a sleepless night because of the environments I've worked in. But there's been a great deal of joy within that journey too, so there's been ups and downs. As an academic, I have expertise in behaviour change science, in other words, how to influence the behaviour of others. I know a bit about how coaches learn, and I did a PhD relating to exercise intensity, and I know lots of other bits and bobs too relating to sport. This means that I'm pretty good at combining theory with the practicalities of what happens in the real world. My old boss Vinnie Webb introduced me to the term pracademic, and that's what I am. I'm a practical academic, someone that really wants to make a difference. Whilst I'm a flawed human being, my practice is underpinned by critical rigour, openness and integrity. I'm known for shooting from my hip, speaking truths that some others are too scared to face or are too constrained to do so. And what I hope to do is present stuff from a position of authority as an expert. Whilst most people believe they know what they're talking about, and I'm no different, I do so through combining high quality evidence with my lived experiences. The presentation is for you if you've got an interest in developing young people in and through sport. And I imagine you'll be a coach, a parent, or a sports administrator, maybe a coach educator if you're listening. When you do listen, I want you to think about what the messages mean to you that I'm presenting and what you can personally do to help the long-term athlete development of others. As humans, we have an inherent ability to attribute successes to our own special abilities and failures to other people. But all of us can always do better. We can work together considering the perspective of others and that other people have different perspectives from us. What I'm going to present today is a definition of what long-term athlete development is. I want to contextualize the environment it exists in and explore the practicalities of implementing a good development pathway, including highlighting barriers on the way. Then I'll provide a few recommendations at the end. What is long-term athlete development? Well, it's a way of conceptualizing the development of young people in and through sport. And we see one model on the screen there. It's often used as a framework to optimize training, to target competitions, how we target competitions, for recovery schedules, in a way that's appropriate for the age and stage of development of young athletes. So we here see a typical one, an active start, learning the fundamentals, learning to train, and then coming into competition, and so on. However, the role of sport in society and how it is funded, I'm talking in a UK context, has extended to getting more people involved in sport more often and tackling things like the current obesity epidemic. In other words, sport and long-term athlete development needs to be all things to all people. But for me, it comes down to two simple things. Two things that we need to apply to all sporting environments. We want people to we want performance to be enhanced and for positive adaptations to occur. More simply, it's about making people be better, or once we reach a certain age, i.e. my age, slowing the rot so we don't get worse. And we want people to keep on coming back. And if we achieve these two things, then I think success is assured. This statement comes from Bergeron et al. And the International Olympic Committee consensus statement on youth development in sport. And they say, the goal is clear. Develop healthy, capable and resilient athletes while attaining widespread, inclusive, sustainable and enjoyable participation and success for all levels of individual athletic achievement. That's what we want to do in youth sport. We want to set young people off on a journey to enjoy what they do and achieve their goals, whatever these goals happen to be. But we all live in a complex society in which our perspectives on what effective long-term athlete development is and what it is for is usually dependent on what bubble we exist within and what our priorities are, whether that's to sort the health of the nation or that we want our children to be the best that they can be. But this means that simple aims become far more complicated, with people in different contexts fighting against each other to get their piece of the pie. At a macro level, at the centre, we have central government, which determines fiscal responsibility and funding. They devolve responsibility in part through the Department of Culture, Media and Sport in England, certainly, and Scottish Government it's a bit different there. So they devolve responsibility with strings attached, usually ones that require sporting organisations to sort out the health of the nation, whilst demonstrating Great Britain is a world leader, with sport being used as a conduit to do so. It's really a form of jingoism, a flawed belief that being British gives us a sense of superiority in the world. Of course, we have sports like football with more financial autonomy to act more independently, and the level autonomy sports have is often dependent on how much funding they need from central government and what central government's priorities are. And then at the other end of the scale, at the macro level, specifically in terms of long-term athlete development, we have children and their parents. But we see in this diagram kind of a complex ecosystem with all these bubbles. There's multiple stakeholders with conflicting agendas, despite a consistent goal of continued improvement and wanting to grow participation in sport. At the macro level, we often have unrealistic funding requirements based on political rhetoric, and at the micro level, people acting like humans. And that's not necessarily a good thing all of the time. In fact, it's a bit like blowing bubbles, in which some will collide and pop into oblivion, and others will connect and float harmoniously in the summer breeze. Now, this isn't to say that good things don't happen in sport. They really do, and some people are doing wonderful things. But what this presentation is about is doing things better. Which brings us on to wicked problems as defined by Rittel and Weber, 1973. A wicked problem is a social or cultural problem that's difficult or impossible to completely solve, normally because of its complex and interconnected nature. So long-term athlete development is complex with a number of interconnected factors. Whilst the aim of long-term athlete development should be clear, to help people move towards their potential and enjoy their sport when doing so, having multiple stakeholders with conflicting agendas. So let me see, here we go. So multiple stakeholders with conflicting agendas means that clarity of aims is lost and solutions are harder to find. The implementation of long-term athlete development models is a wicked problem because it involves social interaction. Whilst many sporting organisations use such models as frameworks for youth development, evaluation of how effective implementation of them is rarely conducted. Therefore, there is limited evidence surrounding how best to implement the model, so although there's good recommendations which we'll explore in a minute. But we do know that there are an infinite number of complex interactions between people in our sporting systems that influence human adaptation and determine whether goals are achieved or not. Whilst I could speak about this slide infinitely, I'm going to avoid doing so because you'll just switch off and not listen. Rather, I'll focus on a few points. So I've already mentioned that there are multiple stakeholders with conflicting agendas. This could be in a club environment, that there is a board or a committee, a head coach, maybe, parents, and then a number of other people who usually all want the same performance outcomes but have different agendas and beliefs about how the goals should be achieved. I'll highlight this one as well. It takes a long time to evaluate solutions or identify whether something's working or not. It can take 10 years or more to evaluate outcomes in sport. Now, some sports will look at the number of people transitioning from one level of a program to the next, in which the athlete needs keep on progressing, otherwise they're off the program. Retention rates and participation are different, but what tends to happen is that when children have more autonomy from their parents to choose what they want to do, they will often drop out, especially if they're no longer enjoying what they're doing. What we must also recognise is that a fraction of 1% of children who enter a long-term athlete development pathway make sport their profession, and far fewer then go on to perform successfully on the international stage, so it's probably less than 0.01%. As young athletes get closer, new challenges and barriers emerge, and they're often higher ones. The journey rarely prepares anyone for winning on the international stage either, so when success does occur, the challenges don't stop, in which the pressures and demands can be really huge. Therefore, problems are never completely solved, as we see in the wicked problem schematic here. You'll see a picture of a snowflake here too. I think I'm making a point. I won't make it too much though. But challenge, stress and unpredictability are all parts of sport and life in general. Dave Collins and others suggest that challenge is fundamental for people to progress through an athlete pathway too. They also suggest that there is far less known about how much, when and how this challenge should be used and applied. But what we must do is recognise the tension between providing inclusive sporting environments where everyone's a winner and the exclusivity of wanting to be an elite performer in which most people inevitably fail. Challenge, stress and unpredictability are unavoidable parts of sport, and remaining happy, motivated and healthy means that young people need to learn to deal with and cope with failure, being told when they're not good enough, when to pull up their socks, when a higher standard is expected, and in recognising Kirkland's 3 laws, which I probably pinched from somewhere else, but I can't remember where. So what are Kirkland's 3 laws? The first one, life is not fair. It's frankly delusional to suggest otherwise. There are lots of people who act like, I can't think of a better word than dicks, so I'll use dicks. People act like dicks. And some people are more advantaged in life than others. Many people I know have been given a rough hand. Regardless of what environment we find ourselves in, there are many challenges in life in which we must recognise it's not fair. Of course, it's important to challenge and fight inequality when it's justified, just as it's important not to feel entitled, to feel that you do something just because, or that just because you perceive others are unfairly advantaged, so they've been given a foot up. It really annoys me in my sport of triathlon that money is almost a prerequisite for success. But that's the reality of the environment. Whereas my time in Kenya, working with runners over there, tells me that it's still possible to perform well in many sports with poor infrastructure or funding too. And I can assure you from what I've seen in Kenya, life is far more unfair over there than it is here. Kirkland's second law. Shit happens. Injury, illness, and lots of unpredictable events are barriers to success. Bad luck has ended the career of many people. Shit happens. It can happen. Sporting careers for anyone can end in the next training session. Can end after tripping over the dog or something. Shit happens. And the third law is the goalposts change. New staff, different ways of making decisions, funding is removed and so on. These laws are interrelated. What's important is to accept that these laws cannot be changed and to develop coping strategies to deal with the inevitable stressors that are associated with life, and in particular the cutthroat world of sport. Failure is inevitable for most who aspire to be the best. This is really hard to deal with when big fish move from their small ponds into the big river and then into the deep dark sea. As that journey progresses, so do the harms and risks. Athletes need to be prepared for the changing demands in new environments, and inaccurate appraisal of ability by athletes, their families and others can make coping far harder. In dealing with complex challenges in developing effective long-term athlete development environments, Martindale and colleagues suggest that the 5 following features are important to be effective. Firstly, that programs have long-term aims and methods, not just short-term things like achieving performance-related metrics or winning games from week to week. Secondly, that athletes receive coherent support and messages. When the club, coach, parents and athletes have different goals, aspirations or perceptions, particularly in what success looks like, then challenges can occur. Similarly, there needs to be emphasis on appropriate development, which is partly age and stage dependent. Children aren't just small adults. They are rapidly adapting creatures in which they may be experiencing changes in their brain, their endocrine system which regulates hormones, and physical changes. All these things can affect behaviour and motivations. Many children, particularly teenagers, are motivated by being with their mates, and their friends are everything. And there's a neural and endocrine system component to that. I thoroughly recommend that you have a watch of Sarah Jane Blakemore's lectures on YouTube about the developing brain. They're really insightful. Then, the importance of individualized and ongoing development. one size doesn't fit all. This is sometimes a very challenging fact, particularly when clubs, teams and squads are large and the available coaches and facilities may not be so large. And finally, there's a requirement for integrated, holistic and systematic development, such as the spiral curriculum proposed by Abraham and others. I'll attach a link to the book chapter that gives deeper context to the model of Abraham and others. So you'll be able to read that chapter if you want, but it'll give you more context. But the model is a biopsychosocial one, which basically means it accounts for all aspects of being a sports performer, including biological come physiological ones, psychological ones and social ones too. So within the model we have movement skills, physical skills, technical, tactical, psycho-behavioural and social ones too. So what this is suggesting is that all these things need to be planned for within a long-term athlete development model. And how do we do so? Well, Abraham and others suggest the spiral curriculum reflects that the long-term development journey is not a linear one. Rather, it's a messy one in which all components must be addressed regularly and relatively systematically. In my sports of cycling and triathlon, there tends to be a bias towards physicality. In team sports, the bias is often technical or tactical. And in most sports, the psycho-behavioural, social and lifestyle stuff is usually an afterthought. We may say nice things about it, but it's rarely planned for. But it's not easy to apply such a model because many practices in sport are culturally based on what has always been done, and it's really, really difficult to change culture. Related to these socio-cultural norms is the knowledge and biases of people, or the knowledge and biases people have of the demands of their sport and what it takes to succeed in it. So when I'm saying my sports of cycling and triathlon have a biophysical bias, for example, and the psychological stuff is neglected, that's almost a socio-cultural norm within these sports. And then we need to recognise that change takes time, and the inherent human need for instant gratification and success from some does not sit comfortably within such models. Barriers to optimising talent development. Which brings me on to the inspiration for this presentation. The paper, Getting in the Way, Investigating Barriers to Optimising Talent Development Experience by Jamie Taylor and Dave Collins. Now their paper was conducted in rugby league, but I believe that there's a great deal of transferability into many other sports within their paper. So I'll talk about some of the findings in that paper. Firstly, we have so when we're talking about barriers, why are long-term athlete development models not as effective as they could be? Firstly, we have the pressure of a performance environment in which business demands and short-termism can dominate. Teams and clubs have financial demands, i.e. achieving high participant numbers of people who pay to play their sport. I know swimming quite well, and I think that's a good example in which training programs are often designed to allow coaches to work with a large number of swimmers so that pool time can be paid for and coach time can be paid for. But this means that it's difficult to support young people on an individual basis unless the coach is really skilled. My Facebook page tells me a lot as well. It tells me just as much as some of the academic literature. I am of an age where many of my friends have teenage children, and because I've been involved in sport and sport is my career, many of my friends are sporty too. Thus, so are their children. And what we see on Facebook is that winning is celebrated, as parents are quite rightly proud. But winning occurs in little ponds, and short-term success as a kid rarely results in long-term success. Strategies are usually designed based on what has happened in the last event or competition for many, rather than on holistic long-term athlete development. So I think it's dangerous to celebrate success too young. Then we have lack of integrated working practices. Taylor and Collins suggest that, to quote, that young people stumble because they get too many people telling them too many different things. Everyone from parents, friends, other coaches, and generally many other people without a clue about what they're talking about and lacking expertise. Additionally, with the professionalism of youth sport in some environments, kids may have the support of strength and condition coaches, sports scientists, and others with vested interest in their success and wanting a piece of the pie too. Coordinating such multidisciplinary teams in complex environments requires strategic clarity and clear definitions of roles. Without these things, confusions and mixed messages is the end result, and these mixed messages help no one. Taylor and Collins also highlight athlete inability to use support. It's not much different from my academic role as a lecturer with some students, in which I spend absolute eons crafting detailed feedback and offering support, when some students lack the psychosocial skills to engage directly with me, to use the support available to be the best that they can be. They can be passive consumers who just want to be told what to do, rather than active participants on their own journey. And finally, failure of coaching practice. Have a read of my article, The Coaching Emperor is Wearing No Clothes, which I'll give you a link to. Basically, many coaches lack the capabilities to deliver integrated and holistic coaching to support long-term athlete development. Coaching is a profession, and it's a particularly challenging profession when working with young people. Yet the level of training most coaches get doesn't prepare them for their job. There's many volunteers in that environment too who coach on an ad hoc basis. And the result of poor coaching can lead to burnout, dropout, and lots of other less salutary things that we don't want to be associated with sport. On this slide, I'll end with the lack of challenge. To quote Taylor and Collins again, athletes are not necessarily equipped to deal with adversity, being beaten, and are often poorly prepared to compete at a higher level. I'd suggest that this is partly due to An overly positive discourse where coaches and others are unprepared or scared to give anything but positive feedback. Everyone's not a winner. My experience of work in life is of Kirkland's 3 laws. Life isn't fair, shit happens, and the goalposts change. I've experienced far more failure than success. So why are we telling people the world is all rosy and everyone's doing well? We need to support young people to recognise such laws, not to sanitise sport to such a level that all potential harms and risks are eliminated. I often use the example in cycling that a top rider may need to descend a mountain at 100 kilometres an hour on 25 millimetres of rubber. Yet the guidelines for coaching cycling mean that I'm not allowed to coach anything with such high risks because of the fear of litigation. Being challenging and pushing young people makes them stronger, but only when coaches have the psychosocial skills too, to help them develop coping strategies to deal with the extreme challenges associated with sport and life in general. Right, on to the final slide. I'm going to end on this slide with 7 things to focus on in developing effective environments. Environments must be supportive with other people to train with. These are the best environments. There needs to be local role models, and I think mountain biking in the Peebles area, is a great example where there are kids in large numbers mountain biking, learning from each other, so learning from their peers, and seeing peers just a few years older achieving international success too. I'm not going to go through all these boxes, we're getting up to 40 minutes. It's critical to develop psychological and coping skills. It's really fundamental. Life is challenging. There's many stresses associated with life, and we need to be able to cope with them. And that doesn't happen by accident. We need to plan for these things. Diversity in training, consistent with the spiral curriculum of Abraham and others, can help. Early specialisation rarely does help. I'll end with the need for everyone to be pulling in the same direction. One of my favourite sayings to young athletes is, "You're important, but you're not yet special," despite your granny telling you that. My granny told me that how handsome and strong I was, despite all the girls saying, "Andy, I just like you as a friend." Anyway, I'll end on that rubbish joke. Thanks ever so much for listening, and please do get in touch if you have any questions. See you later.